He is hysterical. He's one of the funniest people I think I've ever met. He's also very kind. I visited him at his home through Peter Kaufman, who wrote Poor Charlie's Almanac. I was very generous with both of them. Charlie Munger was way kinder than I think people would expect, and just way funnier.
Berkshire Hathaway may have earned 3.8 million % returns for its investors since Warren Buffett joined the team or joined the company. But many people may not know that Buffett's best returns actually came before Berkshire, when he had something called the Buffett Partnership, and actually even before that. But there's a dearth of information on Buffett's pre-Berkshire investing record, or at least there was until recently. I'm going to talk with Brett Gardner, author of Buffett's Early Investments. This is the first really thorough dive into Buffett's pre-Berkshire investing history that I know of. We've got bits and pieces here and there, but Brett did on-the-ground research in libraries and other places where you get paper documents, old school research, and put out a book that I think brings something really new to the table. So we'll jump into the findings in a minute, but first, Brett, welcome. You're not only the author of this book, but you're an analyst at Disserine Capital as well, I should add.
Oh, Disserine Group. Yes.
Disserine Group. Okay, we'll put a link on the screen to that as well. Disserine Group. Brett, thanks for joining us, though.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, so this is not a light read, and I mean that in a very complimentary way, meaning it's true to form in the sense that investing involves a lot of detail and nuance and digging through the nuance to make decisions. That's exactly what Warren Buffett did in his early years. This is a simpler way of saying I just got the book and I haven't had time to read all of it, so I'm going to rely on you to give me some of the details. But first, why did you write this book, and what were some of the most surprising findings from it?
So I wrote the book because I thought the prevailing narrative on Warren Buffett's early success was just false. I think there's this idea out there that it was kind of easy investing. Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett kind of like feed into this narrative themselves, talking about how they found it easier back then. But people kind of forget that they were managing small sums then. Now they're managing billions, and the opportunity set is just smaller. And I do think that it was probably a little bit easier to invest back then, but I think it's overstated. And the genesis of the book was that I kind of wanted to dispute that idea that it was easy investing. You know, people look at these cheap stocks, these nets, and they think Buffett just had to like read Moody's manuals and find them, and it's really just not true. And it really doesn't do proper service to the amount of work Buffett did to accumulate his early fortune. The second reason that I wrote the book was that I thought to really understand Warren Buffett today, you have to understand him back then. You can kind of draw a straight line from these early investments to today to see how he developed and grew as an investor. In terms of like key takeaways from the book, there were a couple I'd point to. Is, you know, first I was kind of struck at how concentrated he was in these days. One investment I read about, American Express, he put 40% of the partnership into the company. And he pretty frequently had the bulk of his portfolio in 3 or 4 ideas. The other was how activist he was, and really control oriented, where it wasn't just taking a single digit percentage of the company and influencing management. It was seizing control, reallocating capital to better ideas and away from deteriorating businesses. The other thing I'd say is Buffett's kind of gumshoe detective type research really stuck out at me. I know that he did some of it, but I was kind of surprised to see how frequently that came up throughout the book.
Interesting. You know, I'm going to confess, I'm one of the people who believe that narrative of all these nets lying around on the shelf in the 1950s and 60s, just there for the taking, and someone could come in and just clean house. I'm glad you clarified that that actually wasn't so true. There's a lot more nuance in that. You know, Buffett speaks in a way that he makes everything seem so easy, so simple, you know, this down-home style wisdom. But it's interesting to know, I guess, that he did a lot more on-the-ground research, was quite an activist, and took a lot of risks by virtue of concentration in his early years. Would you say that that's accurate, first of all? And then if so, it would seem like there might be more lessons applicable to investors today than one would think. In other words, if I have the nets are easy idea in my head, I probably think, well, what really can investors today learn from Buffett in the 50s and 60s? But if what you're saying is true, Brett, then it sounds like they can learn more than we think. My question is, what are some of those lessons that like regular individual investors could put into practice now based on how Buffett performed years ago?
Sure. I think that the main factor that I point to is the focus on finding new insights into businesses. Buffett was very creative about his research. I think that today, kind of investors rely on expert networks and third parties to kind of like find sources, and it's a fairly filtered information stream. Um, Buffett was, drive around Ohio to meet barrel makers to learn more about the cooperative business, which I cover in Greif. And he was driving all across the country to meet management teams and understand how they thought. He also paid people to go attend annual meetings to ask questions and learn about companies. I think he was a lot more creative about going about it than a lot of investors are today. I'd say the most prominent example in the book is Studebaker, where he actually sent. So there's actually a little bit of dispute on whether he went himself or he paid somebody to go count rail cars in Kansas City to estimate demand for one of Studebaker's products. I think that type of research is probably not done as frequently as it should be. And I also think that the level of concentration is something that people can apply as well, obviously. Um, I mean, Benjamin Graham, Warren Buffett's mentor, was much more diversified than Buffett was. And I think one of the big differentiators between Graham and Buffett's success is how concentrated and consistently concentrated Buffett was.
That's really interesting. It's funny because years ago I was at a hedge fund, and I know how aggressive hedge funds can be in their research, like counting the cars in the parking lots and things like that. And we in the investment community take that as a given now. But it's just amazing to look back and see how far ahead of his time Buffett really was. I mean, he was doing that a generation or two ago, and it's just had a huge impact on so many people. Just Brett, let me detour for a second though and ask a philosophical question. In terms of concentration, like I get it. You look at Charlie Munger, you look at Warren Buffett's early years, and you see extremely concentrated portfolio. So it's easy to think, well, I should have a concentrated portfolio too. But then you see stats. I'm forgetting the name, but the Hank Bessenbinder from Arizona State University found that from 1924 roughly to the present, just 4% of U.S. stocks accounted, or maybe it was 3.2% actually, 3.2% of U.S. stocks accounted for just about all the gains in U.S. equities. 40% of stocks have gone to zero. 60% of stocks lose money. It's easy to make a numerical case that people should not be concentrated because most people don't have anywhere near the skill of Warren Buffett or Charlie Munger. What's your view on that for the average investor, concentration versus diversification?
I agree. I think the average person probably should be diversified. I think so. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger have said that diversification is a protection against ignorance. So people who lack the skills of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger probably should be diversified.
Which is probably like 99% of most investors, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. Let me ask you, I heard that you mentioned in the book that Warren declined to be interviewed. I think he said he was too old. How did you feel about that? Did you expect that? Obviously, it would be great to get him to talk to you about the book, I'm sure. Like, what did you feel about his reaction to your research?
Sure. So, funny story. I actually wrote to him about originally 6 or 7 years ago, but this was before I actually decided to write, because in the Snowball there was a memo cited that Buffett wrote in 1952, and I wrote to him asking for it, and I got a letter back from his assistant saying, we can't get the letter, it's in dead storage, but check security analysis, Graham talks about it there, and sure enough it was there. Then when I actually decided to write, I requested an interview, and I figured he was going to say no, just because the demands of his time are ridiculous, and I'm still a no-name author, but I was definitely a no-name author then. And I kind of expected the decline. He sent along a very nice note saying something to the effect of, "This is a super interesting project. This is something I would have done when I was younger, but I can't do an interview." So I wasn't disappointed at all. I was actually thrilled to get
You actually
email from him.
responded, right? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And then once I got physical copies of my book, I sent 2 copies to him and asked for him to sign one back, which he generously did. So I got everything I wanted out of Warren. So no
So
disappointment
he
here.
likes you. He like obviously he's a fan. It sounds like, and it sounds like he's obviously 94 now. So cut him a little slack as far as not doing an interview. You did, however, get the chance to meet Charlie Munger in person, and as a Charlie fanboy myself, I just got to ask you, like, what's your 30-second recap on how Charlie is in real life?
He is hysterical. He's one of the funniest people I think I've ever met. He's also very, very kind. I visited him at his home through Peter Kaufman, who wrote Poor Charlie's Almanac. I was very generous with both of them. Charlie Munger was way kinder than I think people would expect, and just way funnier.
That's great. He's always the comic relief, or used to be the comic relief at the Berkshire annual meetings. Like Warren would give some kind of long answer, like obviously correct, but just explanatory, and then Charlie would summarize it in like a sentence or half of a sentence, like a zinger, and everybody would laugh. The world certainly misses Charlie Munger, but glad you got the chance to interact with him. Brett, let me ask you a question though about specific investments. The book details, I think, 10. And I read a bit about the American Express one. This scammer guy is quite interesting. In fact, if you could have been a fly on the wall of one of these stories, the due diligence process, the decision-making process, which one of those stories would you pick?
That's a really difficult question to answer. I'm going to cheat a little bit and give you 3, but I'm going to rank order them. So the first is Philadelphia and Reading, which is the final investment I talk about pre-partnership, where essentially Ben Graham and his colleague take control of the company and revolutionize it. And my view is that that's, in a way, a predecessor to Berkshire Hathaway. And it was Buffett's biggest position when he was 24 years old. And I think that you can kind of draw a straight line from Philadelphia and Reading to Berkshire Hathaway. So what I kind of want to ask Buffett is, am I right in thinking that he had the idea for a permanent capital vehicle when he was like 24 or 25? Even though he didn't know it would be Berkshire Hathaway, my hypothesis is that he did expect to eventually kind of like run a Philadelphia and Reading type vehicle. And he's basically, done that as good as anybody possibly can. The second one would be Disney, because in the book I talk about this corporate governance risk that Buffett absolutely knew about because it was on the front page of Fortune as he was buying the stock. And I would want to ask him how he thought about that. How did he handicap it? And also how he thought generally about valuation for a business that is almost impossible to value in a way. And then finally, the one you just touched on would be American Express, where I'd be kind of curious on kind of the same question as Disney, where how did he think about valuation, where while he was accumulating the stock was trading at below market multiples, despite growing much faster, despite being a far superior business than the average company in the Dow or S&P 500. And I'd be curious on whether like he had a point intrinsic value in his head, or whether it was just kind of like, this is way better than the average American corporation and it's trading cheaper, so I'm going to load up.
Interesting. And I think if I recall from my reading correctly, during these pre-Berkshire years, he compounded money at something like 29.5% per year. And I think his all-in record is closer to 20% per year. So it means if you kind of combine those two, he was disproportionately much better in these early years. Is that accurate?
So it's funny. I would say, I mean, objectively, his returns were better. However, I do think he's probably gotten better as an investor, and it seems a little counterintuitive that your returns deteriorate as
he's playing a harder game.
Exactly, that's exactly what I was going to say. The game has just gotten much harder. I think that you're investing more and more capital, and it's just that much more difficult.
When you go to the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, you see 40,000 people all in. Even if they don't fit all into the arena at one time, Buffett has spanned legions of Buffett copycats for funds. Now there's a 2x daily Berkshire Hathaway ETF. I mean, I'm sure Charlie would be turning in his grave to hear about that. But my point is, he's inspired so many people, mostly trying to do the same thing, and he's inspired Buffett-style companies who try to fashion themselves to be companies that Buffett followers would like. They're shareholder friendly, really simple, clean reporting. My question to you, Brett, does Warren Buffett's style have an expiration date, or to what extent do you think those principles, or how many of those principles, will carry forward into the future as we just really exist in an investing world that's much more competitive, where Buffett's secrets are relatively out in the open? You've had these factor analyses of Warren Buffett from time to time. Oh, we figured out the 5 different things he does. I'm not sure that I believe in that, but I do believe that a lot of people and a lot of money are collectively copying his style. I guess my point is, just as Ben Graham's style kind of like had its day, does Warren Buffett's style have its day, or is it an ongoing thing?
I don't think you're going to be surprised by my answer, but I think it's going to be an ongoing thing. I'd say principles remain the same, but tactics might change. Where trying to buy securities for less than their worth, less than their intrinsic value, will always be around. I think it's definitely possible there's another evolution to value investing, but I definitely think the principles will remain the same, and the Buffett style investing has no expiration.
Got it. And I hope so too. When people find good companies and avoid bad companies, it's a healthy benefit to society, right? It's sort of cleansing the economic ecosystem in a way that doesn't happen when you're just doing a day trade or some chart pattern based trade. So I personally think that the Buffett way of investing, which many of us take for granted in the value space, just makes a better economic world. So I know it's you're the expert on this, but I'm just adding my 2 cents here. I'm looking here at the book, Brett, though. There are 377 different notes. And for a book this thick, that is quite a lot. Can you briefly talk about the research you did and maybe some of the more extreme links you went through to get information?
Sure. So it's funny, when I first got my physical copies, that was the first thing I noticed, is how many pages of sources there are. So the the book's genesis was really, founded in the basement of the New York Public Library. It's a few blocks from where I am today, and the library I used to visit actually subsequently closed. But I'd read the annual reports on microcard, microfiche. Then I learned that there's this great database that actually has a lot of them on PDF, so I didn't have to go to the machine. And then there was like a point where I decided I actually had to write the book. Like, I thought that there were a couple companies in particular that I wanted to write about, and once I made that decision, kind of the work required stepped up quite a bit. Meaning, like, for Disney, for example, which is far and away the most labor intensive chapter, when I was reading this on my own time, I would just kind of read the annual reports. And then when I decided to write about it, I got all the competitor annual reports as far back as I could. I think I read like 30 or 40 books on Disney.
Wow.
I also talked to academics who researched Hollywood. I also read a lot of papers on like Hollywood accounting, which didn't make its way into the book, I think, fortunately.
It's really weird accounting, right? I mean, that's like its own topic, if I remember from reading about it myself years ago.
Yes, exactly. And well, it's interesting to me. I don't think everybody else is interested. And it was also just not relevant to the Disney investment. Like, there was no accounting fraud.
Yeah.
So it just wasn't relevant. And then also, the other thing that I was kind of surprised at is that a lot of the companies that I don't think anybody today has ever heard of, like Marshall Wells, for example, they were actually a very prominent company in the 1950s. They were in the Fortune 500 when that list debuted in 1955. They were the largest wholesaler. So there was a lot of documents in like university libraries that I was able to get. And I think that was applicable to 2 or 3 of the companies. I also read the actual Moody's manuals that Buffett would have read. And Columbia University actually houses a couple of really interesting archives that I dug through on Walter Schloss and Ben Graham.
It's a lot of work, Brett, and I'm glad you did that. You know, you, like I said at the
Thank you.
top, you really brought something new to the discussion, which is kind of rare. You know, we got so many books, so many articles, and I've contributed to this kind of stuff too, that are basically recycling a lot of the same points, and they're good points, and it's good to recycle them. But this is actually new information, and it took work. And so, you know, I'm glad you did that. Uh, Last question for you, Brett. If Buffett were looking at your investing style right now, either for your own personal portfolio or for work, what do you think he'd say?
Oh, that's a tough question. Maybe he should be. Maybe he might say that I should be owning more Berkshire. Uh, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Gotcha. Gotcha. But you are basically a value investor, or do you have other elements of your style?
Oh no, 100% a value investor. I've been a value investor since I first started reading about Buffett and Graham since when I was 16. I remember reading The Intelligent Investor wasn't the first one I read. I remember reading Lowenstein's biography, The Making of an American Capitalist, and
Mm-hmm.
I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense, and he's really successful. So I kept digging down that path, and I've just always been a value investor.
Excellent. Well, Brett, I hope to see you at next year's Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. I'm still a new convert, and by new I mean I started going in 2018, which is a while now. But there are people there who have been going for 30 plus years. So I'm still sort of relatively new, but I'm definitely a convert. So hope to catch you there next year. If someone has heard our conversation and would like to get a copy of this book, would you send them to Amazon and either website to buy it?
Yeah, so I would go to Amazon. I think it's at least as of right now, they're offering it the cheapest. It's also the most convenient. Um, so definitely Amazon.
Excellent. By the way, if Harry House asks for feedback for a second edition, tell them James Early said make the print a little bit larger so he doesn't have to read it with glasses and he'll pay a few more bucks. But that's just my own personal feedback. It's a great book. There's a lot of information in here. Besides this book, Brett, if someone just wants to follow you, learn more about you, is there anywhere on the internet that you'd send that person?
Sure. I think the first place would be on X. My username is Brett Gardner, BRETTGARDNER _10. They can
Okay.
also find me on LinkedIn. I think Twitter's best. And I can also be reached by email at brett@buffettsearlyinvestments.com.
Gotcha. So Brett Gardner 10, not Brett Gardner 09, Brett Gardner 10 on Twitter. We'll put a link on the screen as well. Brett Gardner, thank you first for sharing your time and your insights with us today. And thanks very much for making the effort to write this book. It's certainly much appreciated. And thanks to you guys, as always, for watching us at home.